You know, I think most conductors would be wanting to meditate or concentrate on an enormous score like Heldenleben, which is coming up in a few minutes. So you're really quite a trooper to be willing to join us
I
here.
was just meditating about what we were going to talk about for 20
well,
minutes.
that's something to think about, too.
I tell you, though, if anybody was wondering whether this really is live, somebody called me this afternoon and wanted to know, is it all taped already, with typical cynicism. And I think the best proof of that is the way I look. I mean, you know, if you consider the sweat and all,
Well, as
I
a matter
wouldn't...
of fact, you look quite calm. You don't look as disheveled as...
Well, I mean, I'm glad that
I
you're
don't
not
think you
catching
work
me
hard
after,
enough. I'm not at all sure that you did it right.
after Heldenleben, I'll be a wreck.
You'll be all right. First of all, of course, the question that's uppermost on my mind is how this new setup of this new kind of camera and this new technique worked from your standpoint as a performer there. Of course, you've been doing with the BBC so many live
That's
telecasts.
true. With the London Symphony Orchestra, we do an awful lot of BBC television, and I must say that if you had a long-distance phone back here now, I would call them, because the new cameras, with the fact that there is no extraneous light, is just, I mean, it's a dream, because the lights are invariably in the player's eyes, and they get terribly hot and ill-tempered, and most of all, they can't see. So if this can become standard procedure for concerts or for any kind of live performing, it is truly the key to the absolute. It's just marvelous.
It's a breakthrough. It's a real breakthrough, and it's something we've all been looking for. I'm so pleased, though, that it's actually working. You find it that way.
Oh, I mean, if anything's visible on the screen, which I wouldn't know at this point, then it's a terrific invention.
We'll soon know from the rest of the world, won't we? I've been asked to ask you something. It's the old question, but I think it's an answer that people are always keenly interested in knowing about. If there's a divergence of opinion between a conductor and a soloist, and very often I'm sure there is, having once in a while even performed myself, it is who is in command, who makes the ultimate decision. And before you even give me an answer, let me say that you made the solution that is the perfect solution last week by playing yourself the piano and conducting the C minor.
Well, it's not really a perfect solution, because I'm much more angry at myself than I ever would be able to be at another performer. But I tell you, that's a good question, and it seems to me that since the conductor is always at least advised or asked before a soloist is engaged for his series of concerts, it seems to me that once you have enough trust and faith in a performer to ask for him as soloist, that usually you go along with his wishes. Also, I feel that you know, the conductor seems to have the whole evening to himself, more or less. And if during the 20, 30, 40, 50 minutes that the soloist is on, there's a divergence of opinion, I firmly believe that it should be the soloist's time to speak. And, of course, with almost any good soloist, you discuss it beforehand, during rehearsals, after rehearsals. You come to certain compromises if necessary, or at least to certain explanations. But I personally feel that it is the soloist's turn to speak. Although, I tell you, it occurs to me that here at the New York Philharmonic, now I'm no good at how long ago anything is, so I don't know how long it is, but one of the most perfectly accompanied concertos I ever heard had the following prefatory remarks. Glenn Gould played Brahms 1.
Oh, that was a famous case.
Oh, indeed. Well, I was here.
You were in the audience that night?
I sure was, and I was sitting in somewhere around the balcony, and Glenn Gould came out to play. It was rather scheduled to play Brahms 1. And Lenny Bernstein came out before and made a speech to the audience in which he explained that Mr. Gould was one of the great musical intellects of our time and certainly had his opinion to be valued, but that at rehearsal he found out that Glenn's way of playing Brahms 1 was so totally opposed to his, Lenny's, view that he wanted to tell the audience that he more or less disclaimed any credit for the performance that was forthcoming, after which he proceeded to accompany it like a dream. Now, I was sitting at that time with Adolph Green, who knows more about music than anybody, I think, and Adolph said, my God, imagine how Glenn Gould feels standing in the wings, hearing the conductor disclaim the performance. And I must say, Carlos, that even then, I turned to Adolph and I said, never mind Glenn, how about Carlos? Sensing disaster backstage.
It never occurred to me that anybody in the world was thinking of me.
I was.
Well, you know, to set your mind at rest, very interestingly, even though I was very excited that night because I knew that it was something that was going to be talked about for years to come. Now, this must be at least 15 years later we're talking about. Well, maybe it's a dozen years at any rate. But I knew that Glenn had read the script that Bernstein had written that night. And as a matter of fact, you know, Bernstein talked every Thursday night to the audiences, so it wasn't quite so unusual for him to say something
He
there.
didn't disclaim it every Thursday.
No, he didn't disclaim. but on this night, he had, it was because it was an enormous compliment to Glenn, as a matter of fact, because as Bernstein said, if it were just another soloist, he would have not conducted it at all. There was such a difference of opinion about it that he would have maybe turned it over to an assistant conductor. And then I wonder if Glenn would have played, but he would have turned it over to an assistant conductor or whatever. But that Glenn was such an uncommonly interesting intellect, musical intellect, and so on, that he wanted to go. Glenn loved it. I knew before the performance.
Loved the speech?
He loved Lenny's having made the speech. He not only loved it, but I'm told that he had it, the recording of that played over and over on the Canadian Broadcasting Company in years afterwards, because he really enjoyed that kind of occasion.
No, but that's typical. I mean, you see, the other thing, though, which I said before, but it has to be reiterated, is one of the reasons Glenn loved it is, of course, for private sense of humor, but the other is that the resulting performance not only seemed totally unanimous, but despite the fact that it was eccentric, I remember it after all these, according to you, 15 years, as an amazing performance. So it was worth being eccentric about.
Well, great performers, even when they don't agree, can make a performance marvelous. There's no doubt. I can think of another crazy instance of disagreement between soloist and conductor, of Richard Strauss, the composer of Heldenleben, which we're going to hear in a few minutes. When he was a young man, he was music director at the Meiningen Opera, I guess, and there was, during a rehearsal, not a performance this was, when Pauline de Anna was the leading soprano, and apparently either she made a mistake or something, Strauss corrected her, and there was an argument between them, and then she got into a kind of fury, and then suddenly she threw the score and hit Strauss in the head, and shrieked and rushed off the stage to a dressing room. Of course, Strauss was pretty angry and left the pit immediately and went to the dressing room, and you could hear shouts from behind the door. And then there was more shouting, and the orchestra was sort of frozen with horror, because that's an impossible thing for a conductor, for a soloist to have done. So then a group from the orchestra went to the dressing room, and there was still this tremendous amount of racket going on there, and then suddenly silence. And finally, one of them had the nerve, and he knocked on the door, and Strauss came to the door, and the man from the orchestra said, maestro, whatever he called him, he said, "We want you to know that the orchestra feels that this was such incredible behavior that this orchestra will never again perform in an opera in which Fräulein de Anna sings." And Strauss smiled, and he said, "This pains me very greatly, gentlemen. Fräulein de Anna and I have just become engaged to be married." It's a wild story, isn't it?
Is that really? Is that apocryphal?
No, this is a real, this is a story. And of course, this same Pauline de Anna was the wife that the great cadenzas, the dialogue between, in Heldenleben, that's about her, that is depicting.
I wonder how much after the argument he wrote that. It would have been interesting if right afterwards he'd written Death and Transfiguration. Well, I didn't know that story. That's an eccentric story. That's wonderful.
When would it have been written? Of course, it was in 1898.
98.
And it's strange, you know, in that same year, the New York Philharmonic had lost its music director had died, and the directors of the Philharmonic asked Strauss to become the new music director here.
And?
Well, Strauss, who was very much a German of the Wilhelmian period, of before World War I, he went with the Berlin Philharmonic, which offered him a 10-year contract and all sorts of things. He took that. He didn't.
You should have thrown a score at him and hit him. He would have said yes.
I think we'd better get on, though, now that we've mentioned Diana,
too. I didn't know, forgive me, but I didn't know that the New York Philharmonic had ever asked Strauss to be music director, because it would have added even another one in, I think, an amazing list of people who've been music directors of the Philharmonic and have been great composers at the same time. Because I can think, I mean, you ask Strauss, there was Mahler. There's Bernstein, Boulez now. When I say you ask him, I didn't mean to say that you ask Strauss, Carlos.
Well, I would like to have been able to. No, but it is true. There's been a great connection between the composers and the New York Philharmonic and its music direction. And then there are numbers of other great composers that have, of course, conducted the orchestra, guest conducted and been conducted. That's a thing. But I think, you know, we've got to now get on to at some point to a discussion of Ein Heldenleben, because that's a mighty work.
Yeah.
The length of, let's
You
say...
would rather discuss that than have me play a little harp for you?
Well, if you play a harp, I'm sure the audience would love it. Will you?
No, I'd rather
No,
talk.
I think we ought, because you know it is the length of a Tchaikovsky symphony, and yet it's all in one movement. So I think maybe if we could give the television audience some kind of signpost to lead them through this, it might not be a bad idea.
Well, I mean, you know, I certainly not a detailed analysis, but it is called Heldenleben, Hero's Life, and Strauss always was accused of having an enormous conceit, and most particularly after he announced that the hero in this piece called A Hero's Life was indeed himself. And people accused him of being very grandiose indeed. But there was a letter that he wrote while he was sketching the piece, and he said, since the Eroica, the Third Symphony of Beethoven, is so unpopular and is so rarely done by conductors nowadays, I have filled a long-needed void, and I have written another huge piece in E-flat, which is very heroic. And he said, unlike the Eroica, it doesn't have a funeral march, but it does have a lot of very heroic tunes for the horns, which, as everybody knows, is the most heroic instrument in the orchestra. Now, how facetious that was, I couldn't tell you, but it is an amazing way to approach a piece of that size.
It is. Well, of course, I think at first he made it, I think he announced that it was going to be a companion piece to Don Quixote, which was another kind of hero, and which was a very detailed description of a specific hero's adventures.
Yes, but that I think was much more intentionally programmatic.
Yes.
I mean, that really has details.
Yes.
And in fact, even though there is that rather remarkable analysis of Hero's Life by Lawrence Gilman, supposedly Strauss said it isn't necessary to know anything about a story. It is simply about a hero and his life and his adversaries. I don't think he...
And yet it does seem to divide, again, into certain sections. I think that...
You're going to name them?
Well let me see if I can. I'll have to. It'd be like naming the books of the Old Testament or something.
Or the Seven Dwarfs. Yes.
Exactly. No, but it does begin with a description of the hero.
Right.
And then the hero's enemies.
Yeah.
I guess that's pretty easily recognizable by the great change of pace musically from the heroic themes to the picky little...
He got a great kick out of the critics at the time, thinking that they recognized themselves as the adversaries.
Yeah. Of course, Strauss was only 35 years old at this time, and yet he's already writing A Hero's Life. And then comes the section that's, some people call it the helpmate, and that's our friend Fräulein de Anna.
Yes,
that,
which
threw
can
the
be
book
recognized by the sound of books being thrown in the orchestra.
Books, exactly. Yeah. And no, it's by the
the
violin,
great
the very famous cadenza in dialogue with the violin. Some people I noticed call that the courtship of the hero, because it shows a woman in all kinds of coy, all sorts of moves, all sorts of feminine moves.
That is a violin solo, if I may add, that is always played by the concertmaster and not by a soloist.
Oh, it's one of them.
And this is, of course, tonight being played by your concertmaster, Elliot Chapot.
Yes, and very beautiful. And then comes the battlefield, when he takes on his enemies, and you can certainly recognize that with its
Everybody will
fanfares
recognize that, yes.
And then comes the hero's works of peace, I believe is the way it's referred to, which he quotes from Death and Transfiguration, all of his own works, which definitely pins it down to Strauss, it seems to me, as the hero of that piece. And then comes his retreat from the world and his fulfillment,
Final fulfillment, right.
A very
All
beautiful
very fancy titles, but I must say the music I find really is at times transcendentally beautiful, and I do adore the piece. It's one of the great showpieces for an orchestra. It does need a great orchestra, but then you have that.
It's very virtuoso work, and it takes, what's the size of the orchestra in this case?
It's enormous. I haven't counted it up, but it seems
Which
an
are
awful
the
lot.
instruments that are called on for really sort of the special parts in this, besides the violin?
Well, there's, yes, the violin solo, and I would think the horns really do overtime in this. There's 8 French horns instead of the customary 4, and they are all absolutely at peak capacity all the time. The whole brass section works very hard, but I must say it can't be singled out, because there are huge solo passages for almost every principal in the orchestra.
You like conducting this work, don't you, André?
Oh yes, listen, I don't think there's a conductor alive that doesn't fall for this. I mean, it's in a way, it's what playing a Rachmaninoff concerto, I suppose, would be to a pianist. it's irresistible to conduct Strauss's big works.
And when a great conductor comes along with a great performance, it's the kind of thing people remember for a long time. For instance, you remember Mengelberg was one of the, there was an old Mengelberg recording on 78 that still people talk about. That recording
It was just
of Ein Heldenleben.
reissued, and you know, we haven't mentioned it, and it's true, it's dedicated to Mengelberg.
Yes, oh that's right,
Yeah.
that's true, I'd forgotten that, yes.
Yeah, that was a marvelous performance. Well, I think, I hear sounds of action. I think
Yeah,
I should get
I
back.
think you're going to have to get back. Really, it is very good of you, and I
Well,
thank you
let me have one more
enormously.
sip of water and I'll go and work.
I'm going to have a sip of water with you here.
Cheers.
But thank you very much for taking time out and coming back here.
Thank you.
And we will shortly return for the second half of our program after there will be a station break here.